All right, this lesson is on factoring when your leading coefficient is not a 1. So it's beyond something that would look like this, where we know all we have to do on these is find something that multiplies to give you the last number and adds together to give you the inside term. So on this one, we would do like so. So this section is about, well, what happens when this isn't a 1? Alright, so let me use some examples. These come out of your book. This is on page 448. If you don't have a copy of the paper book, remember you can get the My Math Lab book the book on the My Math Lab. You get a digital copy. Alright, so our problem is 3x squared minus 20x plus 28. Now there's two ways that you can factor this. There's kind of like what they call the test and guess type way, or there's a grouping way. And I'll show you the test and guess way, and I'll show you why I don't particularly care for it, and I use the grouping way just about every time. Alright, so the test and guess way is that you know that you're going to have two sets of parentheses just like before. And you know that in our front part, whatever we multiply together, we get this term. And then the end part, we know we multiply and we get that part. And then it works out so that your middle part would work out. So this is the problem with the test and guess way. And this one isn't really a hard one compared to how they could be. But in this case, we could have 3x and x, or we could have x and 3x. So there's one variation of what the front could be. And then in the back, to get a positive 28, we could do a 7 and a 4, which both would be positive. Or we can flip-flop those and do it this direction. Same thing with here. We can have a 7 and a 4, or a 4 and a 7. So this is why I don't like this way, because we have 4 variations. Only one of these is correct, and the only way you can figure out which one is correct is by foiling it to see if you get minus 20 in the middle. Oop, these should all be minus. And how did I know that so quickly? Because I have to get a minus for my middle term and a positive for my last term. Well, multiplying two negatives give me a positive. Alright, so this would be our 4 different variations. Now this could get even worse if the first number has more than one way you could make the number. For example, let's say it's 12x squared. Well, I can get 12x squared by doing a 1x and a 12x, a 3x and a 4x, a 2x, a 6x. So you have already just 4 variations just for the front part. And then depending what your last part is, say it's a 12. It's the same thing. You have so many variations. Now, the more that you do this, the easier it is for you to test and guess, because you can kind of do it really quickly in your head and you can see which one would make your 20 when you're foiling. So obviously, let's see. 3x, this would be 12x, take away 7x, so this one does not work. Oh wait, negative 12, negative 7, so actually this one does work. This one would be a negative 7 and a negative 4, negative 21, negative 4, so that doesn't equal. This one would be a negative 4 and a negative 21. That does not equal negative 20. And then this one would be a negative 7 and a positive 12. I'm sorry, a negative. My goodness, I have problems with that, and that would not work. So test and guess work. Some people love it. They're really good at it. They can figure it out pretty quickly. But again, like I said, depending on what your first and last numbers are and what the different variations could be, could make this list really long. The way I like to do it is the grouping way. And both ways are acceptable. It's whatever clicks with you. Your book, My Math Lab, will teach you both ways. And you can choose the way you want. It's not like I'm going to ask you one way or the other. Alright, so how I do it is I multiply my front and back terms. So I have 28 times 3. And that equals 84, and it's a positive 84. And I need factors that multiply out to 84 to add together to equal negative 20. So we're just going to start by listing off some factors until I get close. 84 divided by 3 is 28, so we're getting closer. 4, 5, 6, 6 and 14. So right there I found it. And this is how I always work it. If it's not like you have to be a math genius to do this. If you just start listing off factors, eventually you're going to hit it. And I try to go in order so that way I'm not going to accidentally skip it. Sometimes right away I can figure it out, but in this case I didn't know the factors of 84, so it took me a little while. But I found that they would be 6 and 14. Now they have to multiply together to equal 84 and add together to give me negative 20. Now the only way that's going to happen is if both of these are negative. Alright, so this middle term is going to be rewritten, and we're going to rewrite it with the factors that we found. Now I want to write them in such a way that whoever goes next to the 3 has something in common with, and whatever goes next to the 28 will have something in common. So in this case I want my 6 with my 3 and my 14 with my 28. And by doing it that way, we can group them together, and then it makes it a whole lot easier. If I flip-flop it, yeah, if I put my 14 with my 3, those have nothing in common. So I would already be stopped. Alright, so next step is to group. So I make 2 parentheses. So anytime you see 4 terms, grouping is probably where they're trying to have you head, which means to just put the parentheses around them, and then you're going to factor each group. So in this group I can pull out a 3x, and I'm left with x in my first term and a minus 2 with my second term. And you can FOIL it or distribute it and see if it works. Alright, my second term I'm going to pull out a negative 14, and I'm going to be left with x minus 2. If grouping works, you should have a set of parentheses that are identical. So in this case, x minus 2. If grouping doesn't work, these will be different. Now, the ones that you're given, it should always work if you do it correctly. So if you don't do it correctly and it doesn't work, then recheck. Make sure you took enough out. For example, I could have taken a negative 2 out here, and I wouldn't have been left with x minus 2 here, but it's only because of my mistake, because I didn't take enough out. Alright, so what's left now is the parenthesis that has the same thing in it, and then what is left is your other parenthesis. And you can flip the order of these, that's fine. So that is what we get when we... Oh, I just realized too that we up here I didn't even do the 14 and the 2. So that was another something that we could have come up with. That would have been 4 more things that we could have got and still had to test and guess. So to me, straightforward, simple, short here, and of course we could have gotten more. Oops, this should be x. So you can see, so I would have had 16 combinations for the first one just to test and guess. For my second one, if I do grouping, short, simple, got it, done. But again, it is totally up to you how you go about factoring these. Alright, so let's do another example. So I have 5x squared minus 14x plus 8. And just like always, when you go to factor these, always make sure something can't come out first, because that's usually the easiest thing that we miss. Alright, so I can't take out anything out of all groups, so I'm going to multiply these two, and I get a positive 40. So I'm looking for factors that multiply together to give me 40, add together to give me negative 14. So I'm thinking 1 and 40 doesn't work, 2 and 20 doesn't work, 4 and 10 sounds like it might work. So I can multiply together 4 and 10 and get 40, but they would both have to be negative for me to get a negative 14. So there's my winners. I'm going to rewrite my middle term using the two factors I found. I'm going to rearrange these because I like how 5 and 10 have something in common and how 4 and 8 have something in common. Now let me mention here too, when we rewrite this did not change the problem whatsoever. It is the same exact problem, it's just got a different way to represent negative 14. So we didn't change it. And that's the thing with math, you can manipulate your numbers as long as it still equals the same thing. Numbers can be manipulated. We're going to group them. Factor this one first. We can take out a 5x, and I'm left with x minus 2. And then here I'm going to take out a negative 4, and I'm left with x minus 2. So yay, we have the same parentheses. And then what is left is our other parenthesis. Now the test and guess way, again, you can do it. We know that we could have 5x and x, or x and 5x. We know they all have to be negatives because negative times negative equals a positive if we add them. And then 8, we could have 8 and 1, or 1 and 8. So 5x minus 1, x minus 8, x minus 8. Well, we already wrote that one. Well, anyway, you get the gist of it. And then we could do 4 and 2. So you're going to have a lot of combinations. This one I like because it was short and sweet, and we got to the answer pretty quickly. The only time these get kind of difficult is when you multiply your two numbers here and the number gets rather large. Trying to find those factors that work for your middle. That's probably the most complicated part of this. Alright, so we have 8x squared minus 10x minus 3. So again, negative 24 when we multiply them together, negative 10 when we add them together. So I know that 6 times 4 is 24. So let's see, how can I manipulate this so that we can get a negative 10. So this one is not going to work. And how I know that is because to make a negative 24, one of these can be negative, but the other one cannot. Well, no matter if I make one negative and one positive, I'll never equal a negative 10 in the middle. So there has to be another factor group that works. And I'm thinking 12 and 2. So one of these has to be negative to make it a negative when we multiply, and then it has to be a negative when we add them, which means the larger number has to be negative. So I'm going to rewrite my middle term. I think I want my 2x first. Oops, that's a positive. And my 12x second because I like how these relate better. Parentheses. Factor out 2x here. I'm left with 4x plus 1. So remember 2x divided by 2x is 1. And then here, let's take out a negative 3, and I'm left with a 4x plus 1. So yay, it worked. So my answer is 2x minus 3 and 4x plus 1. Our next example, multiply together, we get a negative 12. Add together to get a negative 1. So I'm thinking 4 and 3 because right away I can think, well, if I subtract those, I know I'm going to get a 1. So it has to equal a negative, which means one of these has to be negative. and then my larger would be at negative when I add them. So rewrite my middle term. Group it. This one I could take out 2x. This one I can take out a positive 3. My parentheses are the same, so we grouped it correctly. And there's my final answer. Now sometimes you'll get questions that are prime, and we'll kind of look at one of those. Of course, this one is a little bit more difficult because the numbers are large. Alright, so we need to multiply 6 and 24. And I get negative 144, and then they have to add together to give me 7. So I'm going to start with 1 and 144. We'll worry about the negative and positives when we get closer. So 144 divided by 2 is 72, 8, 9, 48, 4 and 36, 5, 6, 6 and 24, 7, 8, and 18. So we're getting closer. 9 and 16. Alright, so 9 and 16 look like they would work. So now let's investigate. So they need to multiply together to give me a negative, and add together to give me positive. You know what? I just wrote the wrong question down. I'm like, this one actually works. Alright, so that means one of these has to be negative to do the multiplication part, and my larger number has to be a positive. So actually we found one that works on this one. Let's see, which one is more uncommon? Let's put 9 with this one. And one of these had to be negative. This is a negative. And then we're going to group. So I can take a 3x out of here, and I'm left with 2x minus 3. And I can take an 8 out of here, and I'm left with 2x minus 3. So this one actually worked. So I just realized I wrote the wrong question down. So that one was factorable. Let's look at this one instead. And then this one would be a crazy one to have to test and guess on, because in my front part of my parentheses I could have a 6, a 1, a 3, and a 2 all in flip-flop order. For 24 I could have a 1, a 24, a 2, a 12, a 4, a 6. So, you know, the test and guess way can work if you get more comfortable with it, but the grouping way is kind of short, so that wasn't too bad. And the longest part was trying to find the factor. Alright, so let's look at this. We multiply together to give you positive 18, and adds to give you negative 7. So we know it's 1 and 18, 2 and 9, 3 and 6. So those are our options. It has to multiply together to give me a positive 18, but give me a negative in the middle, which means one of them has to be negative. Now, both of them have to be negative to make a positive at the end. So if I make all these negative, I will never get a negative 7, because this one would be actually a negative 11. If I make one of them negative, then my end product would be a negative 18. So this is a prime, which just means it's already in its factored form as far down as it can go. And then let me do one more, just to kind of remind you to always pay attention to it before you start. Alright, so here's our problem. Now before I multiply these two together, let's make sure we can't take something out of all of them first, which in this case we can. So I'm going to start with the coefficients first. We have 32, 20, and 12. So let's see, 4 can come out of both. So I say let's do -4. And I always like my first term to be a positive, so that's why I took out a -4. And then, let's see, we can't take out x's because our last guy doesn't have an x, but we can take out a y4. And then we're left with a positive 8x minus 5x minus 3. So there's that. And then we always want to look to make sure that this can still keep going. So we're multiplying these two. We need it to equal -24. And then add together to give us a -5. So for some reason I'm thinking an 8 and a 3. I'm going to try this first. So it has to multiply, which means one of these has to be negative to get us a -24 when we multiply. And then my larger would have to be a negative for the middle term to be negative. And that one works. Now don't lose your -4y to the 4th. Rewrite my term. Let's do this first. And then we're going to factor this. Again, I don't want to lose this guy, so I'm going to kind of do this. So in this term, I can take 8x, and I'm left with x minus 1. And this term, I can take a positive 3, and I'm left with x minus 1. So we have a final answer of 8x plus 3 and x minus 1. So just pay attention first to make sure that you can't take something out first. Because if you do multiply these together, you will have a factored polynomial when you get finished, or polynomials, but it won't be in the smallest. It's like reducing a fraction, but not reducing it all the way down, which is still considered wrong. Right, so always take something out first, and then when you get to this point, make sure that this still can't be factored, because they like to do that too. Alright, if you have any questions, let me know.